I think we're connecting and recording in progress. Hi, everyone. We're just going to wait for all the participants to join. Hope everybody's had a good break. I've been trying to get my caffeine refill in. So. Right. So as people are showing up here, so can I just ask, what time is it for you guys? I know it must be early.
It is early. It's 6:30 a.m. here in sunny New Hampshire on the East Coast.
Yeah.
Yeah, same for me in Pittsburgh.
Yeah. So yeah, I think I was up at 6, so it's yeah, not too bad. I know sometimes I've had people from the West Coast states joining calls at like 3 o'clock in the morning their time, and it's yeah, it can always be a challenge. So we really do appreciate you guys taking time out of your early morning to join us here. All right, so I think we'll get started. So welcome back, everyone, to the government track at MapCamp 2022. And as we just heard, so Josh is joining us from New Hampshire, USA. He's a philosopher by training and VP of Cyber Safety Strategy at Clarity, and former Chief Strategist of the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, or CISA, their COVID task force. So in this session, Josh is going to share us a bunch of experiences that he had securing healthcare and vaccine supply chains at CISA. And he'll go into illustrating why Conway's law can kill and what the pandemic helped us to learn about ransomware. Thanks also to Ben from learnworldlymapping.com. I know you guys have been working together on this, so thanks to Ben, who's also agreed to join the session. Really appreciate it. Josh, if you want to get started, over to you.
All right. I'm nervous and excited. I'm a big fan of this community, and I hope to get better at mapping. Just like they say, all models are wrong, some are useful. I hope this is useful, and I'll try to avoid too much cyber jargon and too much government speak jargon and even too much pandemic jargon. But I want to make sure before he disappears too far off camera that I graciously thank Ben, who was my inspiration muse and lured me into this last minute idea to try to show complex government things with mortal consequences. So usually there's a disclaimer that these comments aren't my own and may not reflect those of my employer or the federal government. In this particular case, since Ben was my pen, they may not even reflect my own beliefs, but I've surrendered to a very incredible and talented teammate here, and I hope that this provides good fodder for discussion. Thank you, Ben.
I just want to say thanks to you as well for accepting my request to come in and substitute last minute. We really appreciate that you did that. It was very kind of you, and thanks so much for sharing everything that you're going to share with us.
All right, so we're going to attempt driving through Miro. So I'm going to share that. Ben, please audibly tell me when you can see it.
There you go.
All right, so the general arc here, and I'll explain more in a second, is the organization and mission I have that somehow pulled me into running the national response and arguably some of the international response during a once in 100-year pandemic. Then we'll give you some context on how the federal government in the US and many countries copy this, is attempting to organize critical infrastructure risk and national security, public safety, human life, why it didn't work for something as massively multidisciplinary as a pandemic, and how I brought to bear some Goldratt and Deming and World War II ball bearings theory to try to save lives as best we could. Some things worked well, some things not so much. And I should probably apologize in advance to our good friend Mel Conway. I've really grown fond of him and lived quite near him, but thanks to the pandemic, we've not met yet. But I'm not suggesting Mel Conway killed a lot of people, but Conway's law certainly did. And we should take that seriously and consider alternative arrangements to make sure that we save more lives and do our jobs as the public-private partnership and as a coalition of the willing. So with that, I hope I remember how to do this. I'm going to go to the beginning of this narrative. So again, I'm Josh Corman. I founded a group of helpful hackers trying to save lives through security research 9 years ago on August 1st. In recognition that cavalry isn't coming, I said, what are you willing and able to do? I said, I am the cavalry. And we're going to try to focus on wherever bits and bytes meet flesh and blood. We want to use our hacking skills as the world was increasingly dependent on digital infrastructure for public safety, human life, and national security level issues. So that's our organization. It is a grassroots, a couple thousand folks. It started as mostly hackers, but now it's government folks, policy folks, safety practitioners, doctors, nurses, people in automotive, high-speed rail. It's a growing coalition of the willing who are really focused at intersection of public safety, human life, and hyperconnectivity. We're all initially the mindset of a hacker. And one thing I should destigmatize for this international audience is if you heard hacker and said, wait, Josh is a philosopher hacker. First off, I'm not a criminal. Hacking is not good or evil. It is magic, right? There's terrible wizards that threaten Middle Earth or free society. And there's, thank goodness we have Gandalf and Hermione and Harry Potter to fight the darkness. So A, there are helpful hackers, but B, we're not even all identically oriented. And I like to use 5 Ps to demonstrate our motivational structures. There's protectors that want to make the world safer, puzzlers that like to take things apart and put it back together, prestige that want to be the first, the best, win the white jacket at the contest, a profit, do it for personal or financial or professional gain, and patriotism or protests, for or against an ideology. So I am first and foremost a protector. I want to save lives, and I like really hard problems. But not all of us are motivated the same way. But the next time you meet someone who identifies as a hacker, this may be a useful lens. And one of the things we did is we took our engineering backgrounds, our philosophy backgrounds, our safety studies, and we said, look, all systems fail. We should be prepared for failure. And since all things with software can be hacked and all things connected are exposed, we started writing really simple rubrics like a Hippocratic oath for connected medical devices or a 5-star automotive cyber safety framework just to be prepared for failure. And these became a blueprint to avoid failure, take help avoiding failure without suing the helper, capture, study, and learn from failure, contain and isolate failure, in other words, fail safely, and then inoculate against future failure. And through these rubrics, we've really had a profound impact on regulatory and laws domestically and internationally. But why did I say all that? Just so you know where we're coming from, I am the cavalry. It's not a commercial endeavor. It's 100% volunteer. We've never taken a penny, and we're 9 years strong and growing. Some of that goodwill we fostered meant that when the pandemic broke, the director of the newest federal agency, CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, and I were standing together at the RSA conference as patient zero was hitting San Francisco. And I said, hey, I hope I'm wrong, but I suspect that a larger volume and variety of ransom gangs are going to target hospitals, and they won't care about the impact to human life, but they'll know that hospitals will pay. And if I'm right, I'd like to brief your team on everything we didn't include in our previous congressional testimonies on the threats to healthcare. And he said, if they're not going to attack hospitals, who would do that? They need medical care too. I said, I hope you're right. So a few weeks later, he called and I said, are you ready for that briefing? And he said, no, Josh, I'd like you to see if you'd serve your country for a year. I don't think hacker philosophers belong in a federal bureaucracy, but I understood the moment. And the goal was twofold. Initially, it was to make sure we could protect healthcare against record high ransomware attacks on healthcare delivery in hospitals when our citizens needed it most, but also on their supply chains like PPE or personal protective equipment, ventilator equipment, supply chains, as these were also accelerating the death count from COVID and even non-COVID conditions. And then in parallel was recruiting me under an emergency hiring authority. The Operation Warp Speed was declared to pump tons of money and assistance into developing the first vaccines and therapeutics for coronavirus in the species history. So that was called Operation Warp Speed. So we're going to quickly run through what is the structure of the US and many of its allies resemble this, of the US critical infrastructure approach. Number two, how did CISA change that when it was born nearly 4 years ago as the newest federal agency? Second newest was the Environmental Protection Agency from the 70s. We're going to show how I applied some very Deming Goldrat principles to the vaccine supply chains on Operation Warp Speed, and there's a bit of a Wardley mapping in there. I'm not an expert, but lovely Ben here helped us resemble some Wardley. But then the one that really, made me lose sleep and I have some pretty serious trauma from is trying to keep healthcare safe and available during the pandemic. It was one of the most strained pockets of our society. And then some of the implications, and it could get heavy. So let's do this. Really small font, but the US under President Obama declared 16 designated critical infrastructure sectors. These silos may look obvious to you. It's things like food and agriculture, healthcare and public health, transportation, energy. We've added a 17th one not represented here very recently called elections infrastructure. So each of these silos is a sector that has contributions to public safety, human life, and national security, not necessarily something we should leave to private industry and private shareholder value. Each one of those has a custodian or a federal agency that is responsible for the public-private partnerships. In the case of healthcare and public health, which we're going to spend quite a bit of time on, it's HHS, or Health and Human Services. For water and wastewater, it's the Environmental Protection Agency. For transportation, it's Department of Transportation. For power and electric, it's Department of Energy. So each of them have a custodian, and there's a public-private partnership where there's a corresponding sector coordinating council to represent the interests of the private sector and the for-profit sector. And there's usually a technical accompanying that called an ISAC. One challenge historically is a lot of this organizational structure and typography comes from pre-World War II dysfunctional Detroit automotive manufacturing models that Deming was screaming about, and no one would listen to him before he went and revolutionized Japan after World War II torn economy and devastation. So we are using a fairly primitive and old organizational structure to manage something quite interdependent, interdisciplinary, and intersectional. So unfortunately, given those bureaucratic structures, most of them want people to stay out of their lane, stay in your lane and keep people out of your lane. So it tends to be not just siloed by accident, but siloed by design. Enter CISA. CISA was born out of a precursor in the Department of Homeland Security. This cybersecurity and infrastructure security agency was meant to do several things, some depicted here. But one was so that each of these agencies did not compete with each other to hire, train, and master cybersecurity talent and skills for things like incident response or malware analysis or threat hunting. So to create a shared resource model, much like modern software development and software companies, that could complement this. So if these are the columns of a matrix that are owned and driven by a sector risk management agency, CISA could be the horizontal lanes at the bottom to intersect or top, depending on how you orient this. And for the medically specific things, HHS should lead. And for the cybersecurity things, CISA should be the talent pool that's drawn upon to both set priorities, do identify and buy down risk, and other things like that. But also, I think CISA, as the newest federal agency, was meant to be more multidisciplinary, more collaborative with the hacker community, academic community, private volunteers, and even publicly traded companies to make sure that we have the best of the government and the best of the private sector and the best of civil society to rise to meet these highly dynamic and evolving threats. So eye chart here, but thanks to Ben's skills, it was very easy to import these into Miro. But there are 55 what are called NCFs, or national critical functions. And I have always held that a sector is not a sufficiently manageable unit of risk. Even within healthcare and public health, there are 7,000 hospitals, 10,000 medical device makers. There's bio and pharma manufacturers and pharmaceutical companies like Merck and Pfizer. So they're quite varied in their attack surface, in their complexity, in their funding, in their mission space, and the consequences of failure. So it's not really effective to try to manage risk at a sector level. So within those sectors, some of these national critical functions span plural sectors. So the one we're going to talk the most about today is called provide medical care, but there's other things in here like supply water or energy. Some fit cleanly one-to-one, many do not. And because they are multidisciplinary in nature, to properly manage them and protect the public, you can't keep these silos. So Ben's tweaking me a little here, but Mr. Hacker goes to Washington. So I actually ran 100% of the pandemic response from right here in New Hampshire. I never set foot in DC during the pandemic or a government building. But fair enough, I went into the belly of the beast to try to work amongst the govies. And we'll talk about two swim lanes briefly. One is Operation Warp Speed of securing the vaccine supply chains, partly because it's more of a success story and partly because it's more Wardley-ish for mapping. The one that was harder, significantly harder, was we'll do second. So we'll be back to this screen in a moment. So ball bearings, I'm not going to give you an entire history lesson, but ball bearings was the hypothesis I used to design and implement the CISA COVID task force. At our peak, we were about 100 people of govies and private sector talent. I'll hope to say a little more about the composition of that talent pool later. But essentially, the US put billions of dollars into 7 promising candidates for vaccines. Some traditional, some novel for DNA and mRNA based, as well as funded 23 direct suppliers to those 7 candidates to accelerate the invention, fill and finish, distribution, scale production, fill and finish, cold storage, cold chain, and ultimately administration of vaccines, diagnostics, and therapeutics to save lives, both domestically and abroad. And one of the tasks I was given was there's 1,000 other suppliers that might be important to those 7, but we don't know how to tell. So can you identify which ones need to help and make sure that they don't fall down or get attacked from either physical or cybersecurity risks? So I applied some World War II thesis in 1 minute or less here. During World War II, carpet bombing was the method of bombing for the US and allies to fight the Germans. Many of those targets were heavily defended by anti-aircraft artillery. At some point in the war effort, the innovation called precision bombing allowed the allies to perhaps target different facilities that were closer to civilians and could safely hit their target. And before revealing this capability to the enemy, who could then adapt their defenses and continue to drive heavy casualties into Allied attack runs, there was heavy debate on what should be bombed. The armies wanted to bomb tank manufacturing. The navies wanted to bomb submarine paddocks. Our Air Force wanted to bomb anti-aircraft artillery design and implementation. And a bunch of the geeks said, no, bomb the ball bearings factories. All of those warfighting machines need ball bearings. So think of a ball bearing as a small, weaker, unguarded link in the supply chain that could have a profound and asymmetric impact. So I was looking for which of those could lead to disruption of one or more of those vaccine candidates. So let's map out Operation Warp Speed, or sometimes called OWS, really quickly. The blue boxes, there was a inventing clinical trial stage, a scaled production and fill and finish stage for the winners that had promise, a distribution cold chain logistics, so making things cold, keeping things impossibly cold across large swaths of space and time, and storing them safely once they arrived at the destination before being administered, and then making sure people actually took them in the arm. So the threat actors varied at each stage. The consequences of failure varied at each stage. The maturity level of the defenders varied significantly at each stage, but largely for the first chunk, it was espionage, stealing intellectual property. For the second, it was ransom crews, and denial of service attacks that could have cyber physical harm on finite number of manufacturing plants. Our enemy for most of the distribution cold chain was physics. I had to bust out my middle school and high school physics, which we will wordly map in a moment. And misdis and malinformation in social media really, really hurt us in the last mile, where we had enough to save everyone and we had a really hard time getting people to trust it. So I think I can do this next. Okay, let's talk about physics for a moment. And this is your first approximation of a worthy map. Apologies for my naivete. So citizens want to stay alive. We need a vaccine distribution. Well, guess what? Very late in the process, all of the vaccines need cold chain and cold storage. But we learned that Pfizer specifically, the belief at the time was it had to be minus 80 degrees Celsius, which is incredibly cold, colder than most cold storage can handle. So we did not have enough, and they weren't in the right places, and they didn't have enough cubic footage capacity. So we had to map very rapidly, where are the refrigerators? Can we make more? Can we get them where we need them? And ultimately, we had to augment with dry ice. Well, people think dry ice is easy to make and abundant in supply, but as I remembered from my schooling, dry ice sublimates, evaporates to a gas pretty quickly, more quickly at altitude. So we could maybe make it, but it had to be proximal to its target, and it would sublimate across time and space. So getting it from its manufacturing to where it needed to go became quite an interesting logistics problem. We said, well, why don't we fly it there? Well, it turns out at altitude, it sublimates even faster. So then we talked about production challenges. Well, to produce it, we need the raw materials. Well, one of the raw materials is CO2. And where do we get most of our CO2? As a byproduct of enriching petroleum into gas for cars. And guess what was at an all-time low demand during the pandemic's first year? Gas. No one was driving, so we reduced gas production. So we reduced CO2 byproducts. So we reduced our raw materials for dry ice, which already sublimates across space and time. And we have to reach every corner of the country and the territories. And so it was fun. And it was made even more fun in certain parts of the country. One of the most challenging states was Wisconsin. Why? Well, the first emergency authorized use of vaccines was in December. What else is in December is Christmas. And one of the chief exports of the state of Wisconsin is cheese for Christmas in bulk. So guess you had contractual commitments to the lion's share of dry ice in the state of Wisconsin at a time when we needed dry ice and didn't have enough. So I think, we seem to manage in record time, identifying these ultra cold chain, cold storage, cold distribution problems with, we could have lost as much as 50% or more of the initial Pfizer batches after doing the first thing in the history of the species. But my massively multidisciplinary team swarmed it into some record things. And there's other talks, other places that could talk about the race to defend against physical and cybersecurity threats, including many of these ultra cold refrigerators are internet connected, quite vulnerable, and exposed to any accident and adversary just nearby to some deliberate ransomware attacks on some of the country's cold storage for meat packing. So it was a pretty harrowing time. I hope that wasn't too much detail, but one can map critical path value chains and supply chains and competing resources for any of the various things that we had disruptions to, including nitrile gloves, glass vials, syringes, personal protective equipment, you name it. There were many assumptions that were not sound that got tested and shattered during the pandemic. This was one. All right. So back to those candidates, trying to stay on target. 7 specific funded vaccine candidates, some of which included DNA and mRNA, 23 supporting actors that were identified by those 7 as too important to fail. But there were 1,000 given to my team and I on my first day to say, hey, can you guys use your risk management skills at the National Risk Management Center and prioritize these? To which I believe they said, I don't know how to do that. So my team and I mostly huddled with an infectious disease expert and presidential innovation fellow, and a physician and chief executive officer retired from healthcare to go through what became 4,000 candidates. And we tried to create an objective rubric. So instead of a popularity contest, I said, what are the ball bearings? I see the big players. I see the submarines and the tanks. What are the ball bearings that weak links in the supply chain that, if disrupted, would have a profound impact on all 7 or many of them? So we had a rubric of 6 criterion, but I'm just going to show 3 here. What's the material impact of this technology if it were to work? How big a deal would it be for the species, for the country? We mapped dependency graphs. So how many of the ecosystem players depend upon this technology or this category of technology? And scarcity became a really important one. Was it abundant supply with abundant alternatives? Was it abundant supply with no alternatives? Was it scarce supply, but there were some alternatives? Or was it a sole source supply with no technological alternatives, of which sadly I had many of those? One of them kept me up at night all the time. And so ultimately from 4,000, our rubric very quickly culled it down to 66 that were the ball bearings that, if disrupted, could be devastating. And as we tried to find contacts and reach out to them, our fears were confirmed. They're what I call target rich, as in they're very worth hitting, but cyber poor. So target rich, but cyber poor. One of the most rare, scarce, and highly dependent upon for all the DNA and mRNA vaccines, had a single manufacturing facility, had 3 IT people working there, 0 cybersecurity staff, and you can sneeze on them and we would have had a lot of dead people. So we had to meet them where they are and identify and buy down risk for these unguarded, weak ball bearings. So many successes, many failures, but ultimately we kept impossibly things cold at a crucial moment with some big surprises. But in parallel with that, we were losing far too many citizens to COVID. And I'm going to give you some US numbers, even though I know this is an international audience. Okay, so back to our eye chart. Of the 55 national critical functions, we had an effective rubric as the nation's risk management advisor and risk reducer for critical infrastructure. These 55 were better atomic units of risk measurement. And we wanted to see that health almost treat this like a data center or a service. So we're looking at service delivery risk. Is it, peak capacity, a peak performance with excess capacity, peak performance without residual capacity, minor degradation, major degradation, or full service degradation at the national level or regional level? So we had a scoring mechanism of a color coding, and there were several national critical functions that were in the red week over week. We had to create a purple color because some were so much worse than others, and provide medical care was one of the top 5 at all times. For a number of reasons we will map. Ostensibly, the custodian here, or the Sector Risk Management Agency, SRMA, is the Health and Human Services, is in charge of healthcare and public health. And as I mentioned, silos often try to keep people out of their lanes. You might imagine during a pandemic, healthcare and Health and Human Services is already incredibly stressed and taxed with medical supply chain problems, with CDC, Center for Disease Control, with NIH, National Institutes for Health, with FDA approving emergency authorization. So they had quite a little bit of challenges on their plate outside the world of cyber. So they certainly needed help. And the question was, would they take it? And there was a lot of the institutional memory and Conway's Law and organizational design not yet embracing and trusting the newest federal agency of CISA made it so they really wanted people to stay out of their lane. They were busy enough. They're not bad people. No one's the villain in their own story, but the level of collaboration and cooperation was insufficient. And that's partly why Congress granted the CARES Act emergency hiring authority to hire people like me to join on to design and implement a joint working group, a joint task force to bring to bear the best of the private sector, the best of the hacker community, the best of the government, and span plural government silos to do the right thing, what the public needed, irrespective of whose lane it was. So let's dive in a little bit to that, how healthcare and human services provide medical care is a proper noun here. So there are HDOs, or health delivery organizations. HHS is the Health and Human Services Government agency or cabinet, department, and citizens, obviously. And a lot of us are trying to keep people alive. Well, the best way to do that is carrying capacity. If there was a bus crash in the city and there were 110 people on the bus, all injured, and the hospital can only handle 100, the constraint on our ability to keep people alive is going to be concurrent capacity. Capacity, if you ask anyone in health and human services or anyone in healthcare and public health, private sector, they're usually going to quote the 3 S's. I love consonants and alliteration always. Space, supplies, and staff. So it's some coefficient of the beds you have, the supplies that you have, and the staff that you have. Unfortunately, during the pandemic, all 3 were severely challenged right away. We talked about flattening the curve. It wasn't so much going to prevent how many people got sick. It was going to try to space out how many people were concurrently sick, because we didn't have the beds, we didn't have the ventilators, the protective equipment, and we didn't have enough staff. And these were commingled and interdependent and meshed, and complex systems fail in complex ways. So off to the right there, it's a little hard to read, but in my larger CISA publication called Provide Medical Care is in Critical Condition, you can see these at higher resolution and in greater detail, but these things fueled each other. The lack of proper protective equipment affected the available nurses and doctors, because as they succumb to sickness from COVID or burnout or alterations to their family support structure. So even if we theoretically had enough beds, the lack of supplies strained the staff intermittently as they recovered or had to rotate. We did not typically have enough of any of these things, but these fueled each other in a positive feedback with negative consequences. There are other visuals in this. During peacetime, outside the pandemic, there's a notion of conventional care, which is how hospitals prioritize. If Ben walks in with if I walk in with a laceration on my head and Ben walks in with a major bleeding shoulder, they're going to treat the more injured first because he's more emergent. And so Ben's going to get the care in a conventional setting. In a crisis standards of care, you save the savable and you accept that you will have losses. So if you look at people and some are looked at they're about to die, you actually let them die, and that's the best practice. So there's a continuum from conventional through contingency through crisis standards of care. And during peacetime, these green dots show a region like a city that if everyone's full capacity, everything's fine. If one has a power outage or a mass casualty event, it can divert ambulances to the next proximal care, and the system should absorb that. But during a pandemic, when everyone's already at contingency or already above their thresholds of capacity, a failure anywhere cascades everywhere quite quickly. And what we first mapped when we drew this in November of 2020, of the first year of the pandemic, was describing a city level phenomenon. By the time we published this, October 1st, the following year, this was now describing a state level phenomenon, where the crisis standards of care declared at the entire state level of Idaho caused crisis standards of care on its neighboring states who could not absorb the excess. So let's get to the really heavy stuff. My team, because we had some data science expertise, at the 1-year mark of the pandemic in February, the country had suffered 500,000 deaths from COVID, largely 85-year-olds or older with 4 or more comorbidities, as you might have heard. But what they were not paying attention to, and my team grew very concerned about, was that there were an additional 150,000 excess deaths from non-COVID conditions. So on top of the 500,000, 150,000 excess deaths. And unlike the COVID deaths, these were not 85-year-olds. These were primarily 25 to 44-year-olds, asymmetrically Black and Hispanic. The overlap between this demographic and the essential critical infrastructure workforces that create the water we drink, the food we put on our table, medical supply production, frontline workers, emergency medicine, ambulances, firemen, longshoremen, truck drivers. These were taking a significant hit to the workforce with either temporary losses or permanent losses of these skilled workers. So one of CISA's equities is to ensure critical infrastructure workforce is identified and healthy to perform these 55 national critical functions. And as such, this was an area of concern for us. So instead of merely admiring the problems, we had studied what were the top causes, and you'll see them depicted graphically in a Wordly in a moment. But the most time sensitive were among them: heart, brain, pulmonary, and diabetes. With heart, 4.4 minutes is the difference between life and death for mortality rates for some study from the New England Journal of Medicine. For brain, 1 hour, 3 or 4 hours, the golden hours, could be the difference between life and death. For a stroke, for pulmonary issues, the tolerance for latency and delay for primary care and emergency care could be measured in days. And if you let undiagnosed diabetes go for too many weeks or too many months, what could have been a change in diet becomes a sub-knee amputation and takes someone out of the workplace, or even worse, leads to death. So what we had here was time-sensitive conditions like heart, brain, pulmonary, and diabetes were among these excess deaths. And my team wanted to measure, is there any way to tell when this would happen? These excess deaths spiked 3 times in the first year, in the spring peak, the summer peak, and the humongous flu season winter peak. And you can read this. We publish this data science in the CDC's Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report. But essentially, we saw there was strong positive correlation with intensive care unit bed utilization nationwide. If the country hit 75%, which is usually considered optimal, you would see in one study slice, it was 12,000, and another it was 18,000 excess deaths 2 weeks later. If the country hit 100% ICU strain, you would see 80,000 excess deaths in 2 weeks, and another tranche in 4 and 6 as it tapered off. So remember this curve, because this becomes a repeating motif, unfortunately, and we're about to have another one here in flu season. And it's, again, excess deaths, not from COVID, but from time-sensitive, delayed, integrated access to care. What does this have to do with cybersecurity? Well, initially nothing, but you'll see. So let's map this together back to our Wordly. If carrying capacity is the issue, it's sequencing matters. It's not really how many people we care for, but which ones have the most time sensitivity. Some conditions can wait, some cannot. And the tolerance, according to that New England Journal of Medicine study of US marathon cities, said that a 4.4 minute longer ambulance ride to get around the runners had a measurable, statistically significant mortality rate in 30 days than non-US cities. And that essentially shows delays affect mortality. Again, with brain, it's hours, pulmonary days, diabetes, potentially weeks. So it was unsurprising to see among those excess deaths, these were some of the top conditions. So what about cybersecurity? So we were already losing citizens each time we went through a wave that exceeded 75% ICU strain, irrespective of cause. So whether sometimes some states were over 75% from COVID, some of them were from non-COVID, some of them were for backlogs for elective surgeries that needed ICU stay. And failing to be armed, they did not know that they should manage against that constraint, because anything over 75% accelerated quickly. So back to this model, we tend to talk just in terms of space, supplies, and staff. But what became obvious is that a disruption to technology is a disruption to the force multiplication of your staff. So a nurse that has to walk from baby to baby to baby, from room to room to room, can only handle a certain number of admissions and patients concurrently. A nurse that can look at a nursing station with 12 or 18 monitors and make intermittent route check-ins on the babies that need it can handle more. So when hospitals have become enabled and charged by these breathtaking innovations, they can handle more carrying capacity. When you take away those technology assists, it dramatically diminishes their efficacy and their patient to medical worker ratios. So whether those technologies fail or whether they've been ransomed, whether it's a single technology in the hospital or all of the technology in the hospital, can have a profound impact on not your theoretical carrying capacity, but your actual carrying capacity. And since delays introduce effects to mortality and excess deaths, and ransomware introduces delays, ransomware has started to affect additional loss of life. So many people look at this as a threat to privacy or a threat to revenue, or paying ransoms and fines to HIPAA, or maybe lost revenue from medical procedures, but it is now a loss of life and a degradation of patient care and patient safety. at a time the country cannot afford it. So on October 1st of 2021, the front page article in the Wall Street Journal documented the first named victim of ransomware. Allegedly, a baby was born under complicated conditions before the pandemic in Alabama in 2019. The hospital had been ransomed. The technology that surrounds a typical natal intensive care unit was not functioning. The pre-birth imaging was not functioning. The heart monitors were not functioning. Do they know how to do medicine before technology? Absolutely. So they continued to admit patients and continue to do their best without technology assist. Because it was a complicated birth, an umbilical wrapped around the baby's neck. While the baby was successfully born, it's later died due to post-birth complications. And the lawsuit is likely to settle because of text messages offered into evidence where doctors and nurses were discussing that they never would have admitted the patient had they known, or this would never have happened if their technology was working. So whether they're reasonable people can disagree on the root causes and the contributing causes, we now have the first alleged named victim of a ransomware attack. On the very same day, my team published data science to show this is for statistical proof of loss of life. We studied states hit hardest by ransomware, some of which had month-long outages that affected not just their city, but their region. And we could control, thanks to pandemic elevated death tolls, we could observe that armed with that excess death math we showed you before as an instrument, that in the same state with the same pandemic and the same population controlling for hospital type and size, the hospital networks hit by ransomware achieved these excess death stress levels sooner and stayed there longer than their peers. And in a quantifiable way, we could discriminate not which people perished due to the ransom disruptions, but how many additional lost lives during similar circumstances. So pretty sobering, but the first time in history you could prove that cyber disruption led to loss of life. And I've testified to Congress on this fact. So let's map this eye chart again and then try to get to some wrap up here. So provide medical care is the one in red. It depends on other things that HHS has no sphere of influence or control on. One of them is to generate electricity, transmit electricity, and distribute electricity. So those are handled by the Department of Energy. Another one is transportation for cargo, for passengers, for victims through either medical supplies or patient transport or ambulances. Another is water. You cannot run a hospital along without clean, potable water. And too many parts of the US right now do not have clean, potable water due to, ironically, insufficient water and wastewater engineers that they have succumbed to death from COVID, death from non-COVID, injury, burnout, retirement, and alterations to their family support structure. Because as the nation continues to lose 25 to 44-year-olds and skilled workers, we do not have enough of some of these workforces to keep drinkable water in other parts of the country. So no critical infrastructure is an island unto itself. And while healthcare and public health that wants people to stay out of their lane, as most of these silos do, they depend upon reliable, available other NCFs. So it is a mesh and it is not always available. And increasingly, every single one of these is targeted by ransomware. During my CISA COVID task force, we had, think of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You know, not all things are created equal. This is hypocritical because he never described it as a pyramid, but I will use all models are wrong. Some are useful. I'll use it here to suggest that food, water, shelter, safety at the bottom are non-negotiable. You can go a week without an ATM machine. You cannot go a week without drinking water. People start to riot. So the things that cannot fail, the things that are latency intolerant, should be at the bottom. And of those 55 national critical functions, I'd argue less than 10 are those vital, critical, foundational supernodes in our graph of dependencies. And let's zoom out on what I just said. There's been successful cyber attacks on the water we drink, the food supply we put on our table, the oil and gas pipelines that fuel our cars, our homes, and our supply chains, the schools our kids attend, the municipalities who run our towns and cities, and even timely access to patient care during a pandemic with mortal consequences. We are messing with Maslow. It's not sustainable for an individual. It is untenable for a country. So on the right here, if you were to rack and stack these NCFs. These are just a handful mapped to their sector risk management agency. Some are latency intolerant, and we should focus there because they are too critical to fail. They happen to correlate, unfortunately, to being target rich and cyber poor. These privately owned and operated water and wastewater treatments, small, medium, and rural hospitals, and the overwhelming majority of the food supply chain have zero security staff. They resemble that critical ball bearing for the Operation Warp Speed. They are not doing best practices. They're not even avoiding bad practices. They don't participate in sector risk management agencies and sector coordinating councils. They can't spell NIST CSF or cybersecurity framework. So they are incredibly exposed and increasingly targeted by ransomware. So let's put this in context as we wrap up. Every time the country's critical infrastructure and carrying capacity for healthcare exceeds 75%, we see excess deaths. Each flu season, we have seen 6 figures of excess deaths, and disproportionately, they are hitting 25 to 44-year-olds, Black and Hispanic, critical infrastructure workforce demographics. And if you remember that television show Heroes, where the tagline was "Save the cheerleader, save the world," at least during the pandemic, it is observable that save healthcare delivery, save the country, because our inability to keep up with the capacity needs and save the savable lives of these critical infrastructure workforce is further straining our reliable continued delivery. I mentioned water and wastewater. Jackson, Mississippi has this water has not been safe for a month and counting for pregnant women and for children. A month and counting for a major U.S. area. Top 2 reasons given by the governor: no chemical engineers for the water and wastewater treatment and no technicians. So we have to do better, and we have to prioritize the workforce for our vital critical functions. And we don't actually know what they are because we treat them as all equal across all 55, and we treat them as all siloed across the 16, 17. So that knowledge that with each new flu season, which we are entering right now for the 3rd time, we will see 6 figures of excess deaths. We had specific and actionable. So when we talk about intelligence, it's specific, actionable, and timely. While my team found this in March of 2021, early March, I was unsuccessful at navigating the bureaucracy of the federal government for 7 months prior to publication. Why is CISA doing this? Isn't this HHS's job? Are you sure about the math? Don't we have more important things to deal with? So while we were doing our best on the pandemic-related deaths, these additional losses of life, what did we know and when did we know it? And our failure to warn is an indictment of the bureaucracy and the silos that must be busted. Conway's Law states that eventually your product will resemble your org chart, and that is disappointing for software. It's unacceptable for public safety. So we must be better. We need to be better. So this work must happen. I just outlined how we looked at some of the mapping and dependencies and value chains for one national critical function. How could we do it for the rest? And I think there's hints, just like I used ball bearings analysis and dependency nodes to identify the 66 out of the 4,000. Perhaps folks like you that are much better at mapping than I am could work with us to identify the 10 plus or minus that are too critical and too time sensitive to fail. And we could do decompositions and value chain mapping of the entanglement amongst them. So I went slower than I meant to at 6:30 in the morning. I apologize, but I think we need to tear down the walls. This is a team sport. The reason my CISACO task force was so successful, it was a massively multidisciplinary team to solve and rise to meet massively multidisciplinary challenges. We did not ask whose lane is this. We said, what does the public need? How do we fix it? What's possible? And how do we identify and buy down risk? We set a tone and a pace that is unnatural. Some teammates in the federal government learned and kept those innovations. Some of them immediately retreated and recalcified the moment we were gone, and they couldn't get rid of us fast enough. But the future depends upon a reorientation of those disciplines being massively multidisciplinary, because in an interconnected world with our increased dependence, so the tagline of the Cavalry when we started, the problem statement was our dependence on connected technology is growing faster than our ability to secure it, in areas affecting public safety, human life, and national security. So as we are increasingly dependent upon that, and we cannot depend on traditional bureaucracies and models and org charts to do so, the cavalry isn't coming. You are the cavalry, right? So what are you willing and able to do? And it's going to take some stubborn and tenacious civil society, hackers, philosophers, mappers to help illuminate and illustrate what work must be done. And then we will continue to put pressure on agencies as they get from current state to desired state. So I hope this was useful for any of the remaining time I have, since my time management was terrible. Ben will take the pen and drive around and fly around our crazy Mira board. But I really hope this was useful. I avoided jargon, and I will be happy to answer hard questions because I got some from Ben yesterday.
Yep. Thanks a lot, Josh. It was absolutely brilliant. And it's very, very sobering at the same time. So I really do appreciate that. So we are actually 5 minutes over at the moment. I think
Oh, I'm sorry.
we've got another 5 minutes that we can dig into. Yeah, but again, like, well, you're getting lots of praise from the audience. I don't think anybody minds being a little bit over. It was very, very well done, as we say. So then actually touching on the last point that you were making there of like trying to communicate. So was it 6-7 months that it took you to actually get the message through after you've already found the information, right? This is a common thing I've heard across others who are trying to address COVID during the pandemic. It's like, how, you've got the models, you've got the insights, but it just ends up falling on deaf ears because people can't understand the complexity behind it. And one of the guys who presented a couple of years ago during the pandemic at the International Conference on Complexity Science in 2020, from Lithuania. So his name is Aistis Samaitis. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it 100% correctly, but he was exploring with his team the COVID transmission in Lithuania using agent-based modeling. And they came up with like an all or nothing kind of conclusion, right? And they found the analogy: COVID is like a bushfire, not a sea storm. It hits and it goes like that. It doesn't come in slowly and then wash over everybody. It's just like it's a bushfire. And that analogy really helped him and his team steer Lithuania's response to reduce avoidable deaths, right? So it's so finding ways to take the complexity and communicate it becomes absolutely critical. I know also that Dave Snowden's used complexity thinking in national security space and wargaming and the like, which is all very relevant. I'm wondering if you've tried using any areas of complexity science in your work here, like maybe the social complexities, like the Cynefin framework or the cognitive edges SenseMaker, right, or computational, like the agent-based modeling.
Yeah, my smile is back to all models are wrong, some are useful. What I encountered was a frame that we have these 16 silos and they're self-sustaining and managing and they're doing great, which is really not true. What I've misrepresented here is something that looks maybe causal, right? But these are really complex adaptive systems, and some of these are so hard to map in advance. I think things like dependency nodes or interdependence is mappable. And weight it, you could weight those dependencies and you could do simulation to do this. But my vision is that we both prima facie map the known dependencies, and then after each and every incident in cyberspace or disruption to service, whether it's from a hurricane or a hacker or an active shooter situation, we evolve the model, and that we light this up like a Christmas tree to show how many level 2 outages in water cause 7 level 5 outages in healthcare in the region, or what is the blast radius and cascading failures. So I think if we can map the right 55, I don't think these are the right 55. We could prioritize this subset and stratify them into concentric rings, or like here's the most critical of the critical and the adjacent. We might be able to make the right investments in the right places, but that takes mappers and thinkers and graph theory. And it will be complex and adaptive, but I want to use some of the things we learned from air crashes, like, how to fail safe, how to ensure you never have the same failure mode twice. And unfortunately, if you look at these disruptions, we have the same exact pattern over and over and over, and they continue to be successful. So we're not yet a learning organization on cyber and physical security risk to critical infrastructure.
Yeah.
And no one asked it, but I'll just squeeze this in since we're already over time. Why do I care about ransomware so much? Well, partly I was hired by the cybersecurity agency, and our statutory authority allowed us to look at the impact of cyber attacks. So that was my lane. And while I'm much more concerned about 500,000 now and counting of excess deaths from non-COVID conditions, and ultimately did successfully publish that, I was not allowed to focus specifically on just medical impact. And while I headed in wanting to make sure that we protected critical infrastructure from cyber attacks, I am now an all hazards star risk person. And the only reason I continue to focus on things like ransomware is these are unplanned and increasing volume and variety of disruptions that are poorly understood. And I have skills that can help. And if we don't properly reveal the true costs and necessary resilience requirements, we will see more of these from more ransom crews, but also, as Putin has threatened, nation states are now willing and able to disrupt critical infrastructure if they so choose. So we are prone, we are prey, we've just lacked predator appetite. But in the last 3 years, that's over. So it's time to update our maps that it's not just supplies and staff and space, but it's also reliable technology for the most time sensitive conditions. Thank you.
Yeah. Brilliant. I think unless there, well, I do have more questions and such, but I'm also aware we're now 10 minutes over. So I think at this point we should take the conversation into the government tracks chat. So yeah, so if you want to have any questions directly with Josh, just head over there on the VFairs platform, as Jane was describing this morning. It's really been brilliant to have you on this, Josh. And as Ben said earlier, thanks again for coming in last minute. It's really is appreciated. And yeah, thank you.
Ben for the visuals.
It was
Ben's
just a pleasure to work with you on this.
Okay. Cheers all. Bye for now.